The desert heat shimmered across the tarmac at Forward Operating Base Blackwater, Iraq, 2008. Staff Sergeant Nix Thorne knelt beside the Apache's M230 chain gun, her weathered hands moving with practiced precision as she stripped down the weapon's feed mechanism. The rhythmic click of metal components echoed against the aircraft's hull, a sound that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the early morning hour, and she paused to wipe it away with the back of her flight suit sleeve. Captain Jake Morrison approached the aircraft, clipboard in hand, his boots crunching against the gravel. He was the type of pilot who believed his wings gave him authority over everyone beneath the rotor disc, especially maintenance crews. His eyes swept over the Apache with the casual arrogance of someone who had never personally touched a wrench or cleaned carbon buildup from a barrel. "How much longer on this bird, Sergeant?" Morrison's voice carried the impatience of a man accustomed to immediate answers. He barely glanced at Nix, his attention focused instead on his watch and the mission brief tucked under his arm. Nix didn't look up from her work. "30 minutes, sir. Feed chute had a jam yesterday. Want to make sure it won't happen again when you need it most." Her voice was steady, professional, carrying none of the irritation that flickered behind her dark eyes. Morrison stepped closer, finally taking notice of the methodical way she handled each component. There was something different about this maintenance sergeant. Her movements weren't just competent, they were intuitive. She handled the weapon system like someone who understood its purpose beyond mere mechanical function. His gaze drifted to her uniform, scanning the various patches and ribbons adorning her chest. That's when he saw it. A small, faded patch on her right shoulder that made his blood run cold. The distinctive wings and lightning bolt of a combat aviation badge, but beneath it, something that shouldn't exist on a maintenance sergeant's uniform. A pilot's wings. Not just any pilot's wings, Apache pilot wings, worn smooth from years of wear, the silver threading beginning to tarnish. Morrison's clipboard slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering to the concrete. His mouth opened, then closed, no words emerging. Around them, the normal sounds of a military airfield continued, generators humming, mechanics calling to each other, the distant whine of turbine engines. But in the space between Morrison and the woman kneeling beside his aircraft, silence stretched like a taut wire. Nix's hands never paused in their work, but something in the quality of the quiet made her glance up. She found Morrison staring at her shoulder patch with an expression she'd seen before: shock, confusion, and the dawning realization that assumptions had just been shattered like glass against concrete. The morning heat seemed to intensify, pressing down on them both like a weight that demanded explanation. Morrison's training kicked in first, though his voice came out rougher than intended. "Sergeant, that patch," he pointed with a trembling finger at her shoulder, unable to finish the question that was forming in his mind. In all his years of flying, he'd never seen maintenance personnel wearing pilot wings. It simply didn't happen. Pilots flew, maintainers fixed. The lines were clear, absolute. Nix followed his gaze to her shoulder, her expression remaining neutral even as something flickered in her eyes. A shadow of memory, perhaps, or old pain carefully controlled. She set down the bolt she'd been cleaning and slowly rose to her feet, dusting off her knees with deliberate care. "Yes, sir." Her tone remained professional, but there was a subtle shift in her posture. The deference expected between enlisted and officer remained, but something else emerged, a quiet dignity that seemed to fill the space around her. Morrison struggled to form coherent words. You were." He gestured helplessly at the wings, then at the Apache, then back at her. "How the hell does an Apache pilot end up on a maintenance crew?" The question hung in the desert air like smoke from a distant fire. Other personnel began to take notice of the commotion, or rather, the unusual stillness where conversation should have been. Sergeant First Class Miguel Rodriguez, the senior maintainer, looked up from his own work on a nearby aircraft. Chief Warrant Officer Dana Kim paused her pre-flight inspection to glance over at the odd tableau. Nix's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "It's a long story, sir." The words carried weight beyond their simple meaning, hinting at complexities that Morrison's initial assumptions couldn't begin to encompass. "I've got time," Morrison said, though his voice suggested he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to hear the answer. Something about this woman's calm demeanor in the face of his shock told him this wasn't going to be a simple explanation. Rodriguez had worked with Nix for 8 months now, and he'd seen her handle systems with an intuition that went beyond technical training. She could diagnose problems that stumped more senior mechanics, could predict failures before they happened. He'd always assumed she was just exceptionally gifted. Now, pieces of a puzzle he didn't know existed began shifting into place. "Maybe we should discuss this somewhere more private," Nix suggested, glancing around at the growing number of curious looks. Her voice remained steady, but Morrison caught a glimpse of something in her expression. Not shame, but a wariness born from experience with situations like this one. Morrison nodded, still struggling to process what he was seeing. An Apache pilot, on his maintenance crew, cleaning the very weapon systems she should have been employing from the cockpit above. The morning sun climbed higher, casting their shadows long across the tarmac, and in that moment, both of them knew that whatever conversation was about to happen would change everything. The ready room was empty except for the two of them, the air conditioning providing blessed relief from the Iraqi heat. Morrison closed the door and turned to face Nix, who had taken a position at parade rest, a habit so ingrained it seemed automatic. The formality of it struck him as wrong somehow. This woman had worn the same wings he wore, had faced the same challenges he faced every time he climbed into that cockpit. "At ease," he said quietly, and watched as she shifted to a more relaxed posture, though tension remained in her shoulders like a coiled spring. "Now, talk to me. How does someone go from flying Apache to maintaining them?" Nix was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere past Morrison's shoulder. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of carefully chosen words. "Kandahar Province, Afghanistan, 2006. I was flying with the 25th Combat Aviation Brigade. Call sign Shadowhawk." The name hit Morrison like a physical blow. Every Apache pilot knew that call sign, knew the story that went with it. Shadowhawk, the pilot who had held off an entire Taliban assault on a remote outpost for 47 minutes, alone, after her wingman had been forced to return to base with critical damage. She had expended every round of ammunition, had pushed her aircraft beyond its operational limits, and had saved the lives of 32 soldiers who would have otherwise been overrun. "Jesus Christ," Morrison breathed. "You're Shadowhawk." It wasn't a question. He was staring at a legend, someone whose actions had been studied in flight school, whose tactical decisions had been analyzed and incorporated into training protocols. Nix's expression remained carefully neutral. I was Shadowhawk. Morrison's confusion was evident. "What happened? Why aren't you still flying?" The silence that followed seemed to stretch for hours, though it couldn't have been more than seconds. When Nix spoke again, her voice was quieter, controlled. "The same engagement that made me a legend also ended my flying career. My aircraft took extensive damage during that 47-minute engagement. When I finally landed back at base, the flight surgeon found something that changed everything." Morrison waited, sensing that pushing for details would be counterproductive. This was clearly a wound that had never fully healed, and he found himself genuinely wanting to understand rather than simply satisfy his curiosity. "Traumatic brain injury," Nix continued. "From the concussive effects of multiple RPG near misses, mild but present. The flight surgeon grounded me pending evaluation. The evaluation turned into weeks, then months. Eventually, the medical board made their decision." She met Morrison's eyes directly for the first time since they'd entered the ready room. No return to flight status. Morrison felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd heard stories like this, pilots grounded for medical reasons that seemed minor from the outside but were career-ending in reality. The military's standards for aircrew were unforgiving, and rightly so. But to see someone like Shadowhawk reduced to maintenance duty seemed like a cruel irony. The weight of his earlier assumptions pressed down on him like the desert heat outside. "So you stayed in," Morrison said, though it was more observation than question. "Why not get out? With your record, you could have written your own ticket in the civilian world." A ghost of a smile touched Nix's lips, but there was no humor in it. "Where else was I going to go? The army was home. These birds," she gestured toward the wall in the direction of the flight line, "they're my life. If I couldn't fly them anymore, at least I could keep them flying." Morrison found himself reassessing everything he thought he knew about the maintenance crew, about the careful hierarchy that separated pilots from everyone else. "How long have you been doing this? Maintenance work?" 2 years, Nix replied. "Started at Fort Carson, then deployed here with this unit. Most people don't look too closely at patches and ribbons. They see the rank, the job description, and that's enough." "But you still remember," Morrison said. It wasn't really a question. He could see it in the way she'd handled the weapon system, in the intuitive understanding she displayed. "You still know these aircraft better than most pilots." "Better than some," Nix corrected gently. "Different than others. A pilot sees the Apache as an extension of themselves. I see it as both that and as a collection of systems that need to work flawlessly to keep that pilot alive. It's a different perspective." Morrison was quiet for several minutes, processing not just what he'd learned, but how fundamentally it changed his understanding of the woman standing before him. This wasn't just a competent maintenance sergeant. This was someone who had been where he was, who understood the weight of responsibility that came with those controls, who knew intimately what it felt like to have 32 lives depending on your skill and your aircraft's reliability. "Does anyone else know?" he asked finally. "Rodriguez suspects something. He's too good at his job not to notice that I work differently than most mechanics, but he's never asked directly, and I've never volunteered the information." Nix's tone suggested she preferred it that way. Morrison understood. Military culture was complicated, full of unspoken hierarchies and assumptions. A former pilot working maintenance would be seen as either inspiring or tragic, depending on who was doing the looking. Neither perspective was particularly comfortable to live with. Outside, they could hear the sounds of the morning mission brief beginning. Pilots gathering, aircraft being prepped, the familiar ritual of another day of combat operations in a war that seemed to have no end. The irony wasn't lost on Morrison. He was about to climb into an aircraft that had been prepared by someone who was arguably better qualified to fly it than he was. The thought should have been humbling, and he realized with some surprise that it was. His earlier arrogance seemed not just misplaced but actively foolish. "I want you to know," Morrison said carefully, "that this conversation doesn't leave this room unless you want it to. Your business is your business." Nix nodded, appreciation flickering in her eyes. "Thank you, sir. But I also want you to know that if you ever want to talk shop, pilot to pilot, I'm available." Morrison paused, then added, "I have a feeling I could learn a thing or two from someone with your experience." For the first time since their conversation began, Nix's smile seemed genuine. "I'd like that, sir." As they prepared to leave the ready room, Morrison found himself wondering how many other assumptions he'd made over the years that were equally unfounded. How many people had he overlooked, dismissed, or categorized based on surface appearances? The desert heat hit them again as they stepped outside, but somehow it felt less oppressive than it had before. The morning light had shifted, and the Apache waiting on the tarmac looked different to Morrison now, not just as his aircraft, but as something that connected him to the woman walking beside him, someone who understood its capabilities and limitations in ways that went beyond technical specifications. The mission brief was already underway when Morrison slipped into the briefing room. Major Patricia Hendricks, the squadron commander, was discussing the day's objectives, a reconnaissance mission along a known insurgent supply route, with potential for close air support if ground units made contact. Standard stuff, the kind of mission Morrison had flown dozens of times. But as he listened to the briefing, his mind kept drifting to Nix and her story. Shadowhawk. The name carried weight in military aviation circles, representing the kind of split-second decision-making and tactical excellence that every pilot aspired to achieve. And she was outside right now, putting the final touches on his aircraft, ensuring that every system would function flawlessly when he needed it most. Morrison, Major Hendrick's sharp voice cut through his wandering thoughts. "You with us?" "Yes, ma'am." Morrison straightened, focusing on the tactical display showing their assigned patrol sector. "Just mentally reviewing the maintenance status of my bird." It wasn't entirely a lie, though the maintenance status he was thinking about went far beyond mechanical concerns. As Hendricks continued the briefing, Morrison found himself paying attention with renewed intensity. If someone like Shadowhawk thought it was worth staying in the fight through maintenance work, then maybe he owed it to both of them to be the best pilot he could be. The briefing concluded with the usual reminders about radio protocols, emergency procedures, and rules of engagement. As the pilots filed out to conduct their pre-flight inspections, Morrison lingered for a moment, checking his watch. He wanted to speak with Nix again before takeoff, though he wasn't entirely sure why. Perhaps it was professional courtesy, pilot to pilot. Perhaps it was something else entirely. He found her exactly where he'd left her, making final adjustments to the chain gun's alignment. Her movements were precise, economical, those of someone who understood that attention to detail could mean the difference between life and death for the person who would be depending on this weapon in combat. "How's she looking?" Morrison asked, approaching the aircraft. Nix glanced up from her work. "Ready for whatever you need her to do." She paused, then added, "I replaced the backup firing pin as a precaution. The primary is fine, but I noticed some wear that might cause problems down the line." Morrison nodded, impressed despite himself. That kind of preventive thinking was the hallmark of someone who understood the real-world implications of mechanical failure. Good catch. As he began his pre-flight inspection, Morrison found himself seeing his aircraft through different eyes. Every system Nix had checked and certified represented not just mechanical function, but operational capability. The collective pitch controls she had calibrated would determine his ability to maneuver. The targeting system she had aligned would affect his accuracy. The engine components she had serviced would determine whether he made it home. "Sir," Nix's voice interrupted his thoughts. Morrison looked up to find her standing near the aircraft's tail, her expression serious. "Be careful out there. The intelligence brief mentioned increased RPG activity in your sector. They're getting better at predicting our flight patterns." There was something in her tone that went beyond routine concern. The voice of someone who had faced those same threats, who understood intimately what it meant to fly into hostile territory with people on the ground, depending on your success. "I will," Morrison promised. "And Nix," she looked up at the informal use of her first name, "thanks for the heads up, all of it." She nodded once, a gesture that seemed to convey understanding on multiple levels. Then she stepped back as Morrison climbed into the cockpit, her role in his mission complete, but somehow more significant than it had been an hour earlier. As Morrison ran through his startup procedures, he found himself thinking about the difference between knowing something intellectually and understanding it viscerally. He had known that maintenance personnel were important. Every pilot learned that in training. But he had never truly understood the depth of knowledge and experience that someone like Nix brought to her work, the way her previous experience as a pilot informed every adjustment, every replacement, every decision she made about his aircraft's readiness. The turbine engines spooled up with their characteristic whine, and Morrison felt the familiar thrill of anticipation that came with the beginning of every mission. But today, that anticipation was tempered by a new appreciation for the people who made his job possible. Not just possible, safe. As he lifted off from the base and turned toward his assigned patrol sector, Morrison keyed his radio. Blackwater Tower, Apache 27 departing to the northeast. Roger, Apache 27, good hunting. Good hunting, indeed. But today, Morrison understood that successful hunting depended on more than just his skill as a pilot. It depended on the expertise and dedication of people like Nix Thorne, people whose contributions often went unnoticed but whose impact was absolutely vital. The Iraqi landscape spread out below him, a patchwork of desert, irrigation channels, and scattered settlements that had become familiar over multiple deployments. But somehow, it looked different today, more complex, more deserving of the respect that came with understanding just how many people were invested in his success and safe return. 20 minutes into the mission, Morrison's radio crackled with an urgent transmission. Apache 27, this is Dustoff 72. We have troops in contact. Grid 38S MD 23,847, 65,923. Multiple casualties. Need immediate close air support. Morrison's training took over instantly. Dustoff 72, Apache 27 copies. Inbound to your position, ETA 4 minutes. He banked the aircraft hard to the left, pushing the engines to maximum continuous power as he raced toward the coordinates. This was what everything came down to: the training, the maintenance, the endless hours of preparation. Somewhere ahead, American soldiers were under fire, and their lives depended on his ability to bring effective firepower to bear on their behalf. As the Apache ate up the distance to the contact site, Morrison found himself thinking about Nix's warning about increased RPG activity. That wasn't just casual conversation. That was tactical intelligence from someone who understood the implications better than most. He made a mental note to vary his attack patterns more than usual, to avoid predictable flight paths that might make him an easy target. Apache 27, Dustoff 72. We're taking fire from a tree line approximately 200 meters east of the landing zone. At least 2 machine gun positions, possibly more. Morrison could see the situation developing ahead of him. The distinctive dust cloud of a medical evacuation helicopter hovering over a small clearing, tracer fire, reaching up from concealed positions along the eastern edge of the area. The geometry was clear. The medical crew couldn't complete their mission until those weapons were silenced. Dustoff 72, Apache 27 has visual on hostile positions, moving to engage. This was the moment that separated theory from reality, training from combat. Morrison rolled the Apache into an attack run, the weapon systems that Nix had so carefully maintained now coming into play. The M230 chain gun that she had cleaned and calibrated swiveled toward the target as Morrison's thumb found the trigger. The first burst was precise, walking a line of 30 rounds through the suspected machine gun position. The hostile fire ceased immediately, either because the enemy was neutralized or because they had gone to ground to avoid the Apache's devastating firepower. Good effect on target, Morrison reported, engaging secondary position. But as he set up for his second attack run, Morrison saw the telltale flash of a rocket-propelled grenade launch from the tree line. His earlier conversation with Nix flashed through his mind, and he immediately broke from his planned attack pattern, rolling the aircraft into an evasive maneuver that took him well clear of his previous flight path. The RPG detonated harmlessly off to his left, close enough to rattle the aircraft but far enough away to avoid serious damage. Morrison's deviation from standard attack doctrine had probably saved his life. Apache 27, nice flying, came the voice of the ground controller. We have movement in the northern section of the tree line. Morrison acquired the new target and engaged with the chain gun, suppressing the enemy position long enough for the medical helicopter to complete its mission. As the dust-off bird lifted away with its cargo of wounded soldiers, Morrison continued to patrol the area, ensuring that no additional threats emerged to complicate the evacuation. It was only after he had returned to base and shut down the aircraft that Morrison realized how much his morning conversation with Nix had influenced his tactical decisions. Her warning about RPG activity had made him more cautious, more aware of the need to vary his attack patterns. Her intimate knowledge of the weapon systems had given him confidence that everything would function exactly as intended when he needed it most. But more than that, her story had reminded him that every mission was part of something larger, a complex web of mutual dependence where everyone's contribution mattered, where the distinction between important and support roles was often meaningless. As he climbed down from the cockpit, Morrison saw Nix approaching with her post-flight inspection checklist. Her expression was professionally neutral, but he caught a flicker of relief in her eyes when she saw him walking away from the aircraft under his own power. "How did she perform?" Nix asked, beginning her systematic examination of the aircraft's condition. "Flawlessly," Morrison replied. "That backup firing pin replacement was a good call. I put a lot of rounds downrange today." Nix nodded, making notes on her clipboard. Any anomalies, vibrations, unusual noises, performance issues. Morrison was about to give the standard negative response when he paused. This wasn't just routine maintenance questioning. This was one professional seeking information from another, someone who understood the implications of every detail. "The collective felt a little sluggish during high-G maneuvers," Morrison said. "Nothing dangerous, but noticeable. And I thought I heard a slight whistle in the cabin ventilation system during cruise flight." Nix made additional notes, her expression thoughtful. "I'll check the hydraulic pressure settings on the collective and inspect the cabin air seals. Probably minor adjustments, but you're right to mention them." As she continued her inspection, Morrison found himself watching her work with new appreciation. This wasn't just a maintenance sergeant going through a checklist. This was a former pilot ensuring that the next person to fly this aircraft would have every advantage she could provide. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows across the flight line, and the tempo of operations was winding down toward evening. But Morrison lingered near his aircraft, not quite ready to head to the debriefing room where he would file his mission report and analyze the day's engagement. "Nix," he said, causing her to look up from her inspection. "I wanted to thank you for the heads up about the RPGs. That intel probably saved my life today." She paused in her work, meeting his eyes directly. "That's what we do here. We take care of each other." Morrison nodded, understanding that her words carried weight beyond their simple meaning. In the complex hierarchy of military service, formal ranks and job descriptions only told part of the story. The real story was about people taking care of people, about shared responsibility for mission success and personal survival. "I was thinking," Morrison continued, "that maybe we could set up some informal sessions, you and me, maybe some of the other pilots and maintenance folks. Share perspectives, talk about things we've learned." Nix's expression showed surprise, then consideration. "You think people would be interested in that?" "I think people might be more interested than you'd expect," Morrison replied. "There's a lot we could learn from each other." As if to punctuate his point, Chief Warrant Officer Kim approached their position, her own post-flight inspection complete. "Morrison, good work today. I heard you broke pattern during your second attack run. Smart flying." "Actually," Morrison said, glancing at Nix, "that was based on some tactical intelligence from our maintenance team. They've been tracking enemy adaptation to our standard procedures." Kim's eyebrows rose slightly. "Is that so?" She looked at Nix with new interest. "What else have you been tracking?" Nix seemed surprised to be directly addressed by a pilot, but her professional composure didn't waver. We've noticed patterns in the timing of attacks, preferences for certain types of terrain, adaptations to our countermeasures. Maintenance gives us a different perspective on these things. We see the damage patterns, the failure modes, the wear characteristics that tell stories about how the enemy is adapting. Kim was clearly intrigued. Have you documented any of this? Informally, Nix replied. It's not really part of our official responsibilities. Maybe it should be, Kim suggested. This sounds like valuable tactical intelligence that isn't making it up the chain of command. Morrison watched the interaction with growing excitement. This was exactly what he had hoped might happen, recognition that valuable insights could come from unexpected sources, that the artificial barriers between different military specialties sometimes obscured important information. What would you think about putting together a presentation for the next pilots' meeting? Kim asked Nix directly. Share some of these observations with the flight crews. Nix looked uncertain. I'm not sure that's appropriate, ma'am. I'm just maintenance. You're someone with unique insights into enemy tactics and aircraft performance, Kim corrected. That makes you exactly the right person to brief pilots on these issues. Morrison could see Nix processing this unexpected opportunity and the complications it might create. Stepping into a more visible role would mean revealing more about her background, potentially opening up questions she might prefer to avoid. I'll think about it, Nix said finally. Do that, Kim replied. Morrison, good job today, both of you. As Kim walked away, Morrison and Nix stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the last light of day paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. This could be good, Morrison said eventually. A chance to share what you know without having to explain all the background details. Nix nodded slowly. Maybe. It's been a long time since I thought about tactics from a pilot's perspective. I'm not sure I remember how to brief other aviators. I suspect it's like riding a bicycle, Morrison replied. And besides, you wouldn't be briefing them as a pilot. You'd be briefing them as someone with a unique analytical perspective on enemy behavior and aircraft performance. The distinction seemed to resonate with Nix. She could share her knowledge without necessarily revealing the source of that knowledge, could contribute to mission success without having to revisit painful memories of her transition from pilot to maintainer. I'll think about it, she repeated, but Morrison could hear the shift in her tone, from uncertainty to cautious possibility. As they finished the post-flight procedures and secured the aircraft for the night, Morrison reflected on how much had changed in the span of a single day. This morning, he had approached his aircraft with the casual confidence of someone who took maintenance support for granted. Tonight, he understood that the person responsible for that support was someone whose experience and insights could enhance not just his individual performance, but the effectiveness of their entire unit. More than that, he had begun to understand that military service was far more complex and interconnected than the simple hierarchies suggested. Excellence could emerge from unexpected places, and valuable contributions came in forms that weren't always immediately recognizable. The evening briefing would cover the day's missions, assess lessons learned, and plan for tomorrow's operations. But Morrison suspected that the most important lesson of the day, about assumptions, respect, and the true meaning of teamwork, wouldn't appear in any official report. That night, as Morrison sat in his quarters writing his mission report, he found himself thinking about leadership and what it really meant. He had always assumed that leadership was about giving orders, making decisions, and taking responsibility for outcomes. But his conversation with Nix had suggested a different model, leadership as the ability to recognize and utilize the strengths of everyone around you, regardless of their official position or apparent role. In the military, the concept of leading from behind was often discussed but rarely practiced. It required a fundamental shift in perspective, From seeing yourself as the most important person in any given situation to seeing yourself as someone whose job was to help everyone else perform at their best. Morrison's laptop screen glowed in the semi-darkness as he tried to capture the day's events in the clinical language required by military reporting formats. Mission accomplished. No casualties. Enemy positions neutralized. Aircraft performance satisfactory. The words were accurate but completely inadequate to describe what had actually happened. The tactical insights that had influenced his decision-making. The maintenance excellence that had ensured his weapons functioned flawlessly. The broader questions about how military organizations could better leverage the full range of talents and experiences present in their ranks. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. Morrison opened it to find Chief Kim standing in the hallway, still wearing her flight suit despite the late hour. "Got a minute?" she asked. "Sure, come in." Morrison gestured her into his small quarters, clearing some papers off the only chair so she could sit down. Kim settled herself and got straight to the point. "I've been thinking about our conversation this afternoon, about your maintenance sergeant and her tactical observations." Morrison nodded, waiting to see where this was heading. "I did some checking," Kim continued. "Looked at Sergeant Thorne's service record, or at least the parts I have access to." Morrison felt a flutter of concern. He had promised Nix that their morning conversation would remain private, but he hadn't anticipated that his suggestion about briefing pilots might lead to official scrutiny of her background. "And," Morrison asked carefully. Kim leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "And I discovered that your maintenance sergeant has some very interesting qualifications that aren't reflected in her current position." The careful way Kim phrased her statement suggested she knew exactly what she was talking about. Morrison decided that discretion was the better part of valor. "I'm not sure what you mean, ma'am." Kim smiled slightly. "Of course you're not. But I am sure that if someone with her background were to brief our pilots on tactical developments, it would be an extremely valuable use of everyone's time." Morrison began to understand that Kim knew far more about Nix's history than she was letting on, and that she was approaching the situation with the kind of careful diplomacy that suggested genuine respect for Nix's privacy, while still recognizing the potential value of her expertise. "I think you're right about that," Morrison said carefully. "I'm glad we agree," Kim replied. "I'm planning to speak with Major Hendricks tomorrow about setting up some cross-functional discussions between flight crews and maintenance personnel. Nothing formal, nothing that would require anyone to reveal information they'd prefer to keep private. Just professional conversations about how we can all do our jobs better." Morrison felt a surge of respect for Kim's approach. She was creating an opportunity for people like Nix to contribute their insights without forcing them to expose personal information they might prefer to keep confidential. "I think that's an excellent idea," Morrison said. Kim stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Morrison, you did something important today. Not just the mission, though that was solid work, but recognizing that valuable perspectives can come from unexpected places and having the courage to act on that recognition. That's the kind of leadership this unit needs." After Kim left, Morrison sat in the quiet of his quarters, processing the day's events and their implications. He had begun the morning with a set of assumptions about military hierarchies, about the role of different specialties, about what constituted important contributions to mission success. By evening, those assumptions had been fundamentally challenged and largely discarded. But more than that, he had begun to understand that real leadership often involved getting out of the way, creating space for other people's expertise to emerge, facilitating connections between people who might not normally interact, and ensuring that valuable insights reached the people who could act on them. The next morning brought the familiar rhythm of flight line operations, but with subtle differences that reflected the previous day's conversations. Morrison arrived at his aircraft to find not just Nix conducting pre-flight maintenance, but also Rodriguez and two other maintainers discussing some technical issue with unusual animation. "Morning," Morrison called out as he approached. "Everything okay with the bird?" Rodriguez looked up with a grin. "Better than okay. Nix figured out why we've been having intermittent targeting system glitches on several aircraft. Turns out it's not a maintenance issue at all. It's a tactical adaptation by the enemy." Morrison's interest sharpened immediately. "How so?" Nix stepped forward, her manner more confident than it had been the previous morning. "We've been tracking the timing of targeting system failures, and they correlate with specific geographic areas and enemy contact reports. It looks like they're using some kind of electronic countermeasure that interferes with our targeting computers. Which explains why the failures are intermittent and location-specific," Rodriguez added. "It's not equipment failure, it's electronic warfare." Morrison felt a chill run down his spine. Electronic warfare capabilities in the hands of insurgent forces represented a significant escalation in threat level, one that could affect not just individual missions, but the entire strategic situation in their area of operations. "Have you reported this up the chain?" Morrison asked. "That's the thing," Nix replied. "It's not really clear whose responsibility it is. It's not a maintenance issue, so it doesn't go through normal maintenance channels. But it's not traditional intelligence either, so the intel people aren't sure what to do with it." Morrison understood the problem immediately. Military organizations were excellent at handling issues that fell clearly within established categories, but they often struggled with problems that crossed traditional boundaries. This discovery was simultaneously a maintenance issue, an intelligence matter, and a tactical concern, which meant it could easily fall through the cracks of organizational responsibility. "We need to get this to Major Hendricks immediately," Morrison said, "and probably to brigade-level intelligence as well." "Already working on it," came a voice from behind them. Morrison turned to see Chief Kim approaching, accompanied by Major Hendricks herself. "I briefed the Major on yesterday's discussions, and she wanted to hear directly from your maintenance team about their tactical observations." Major Hendricks stepped forward, her expression serious but not unfriendly. "Sergeant Thorne, I understand you've been tracking some patterns that might represent enemy adaptation to our tactics." Nick straightened to attention. "Yes, ma'am. We've identified what appears to be electronic warfare capabilities that are causing intermittent failures in our targeting systems." "Show me," Hendricks said simply. For the next 20 minutes, Nix walked the Major through her analysis. Correlation charts showing the relationship between targeting system failures and geographic locations, timing data that suggested coordinated enemy action,